this country, whether you like it or not. Electoral outcome are only from mass consciousness, not media creates. Media has to mirror, media has to reflect what's happening on the ground somewhere and help the people in arriving at much more informed debate, informed opinion. I think that's how democracy survives. So I have a feeling, 2 weeks back I gave a lecture in Thrissur on media because it was Achyut Walyar, one of the very dedicated journalists, very legendary journalist. I said, media misinformation, fourth estate to real estate. This seems to be changing character of the media broadly at a macro level. I think we have to come back and try to see that how masses of this country can be helped by the media and how media can stand by the popular aspirations. I think it's a challenge of the media. As things stand today, things seem to be not going in the right direction. And therefore, I feel that perhaps this motion is something which we have to very seriously debate, and I very strongly support this motion. Thank you very much.
Began by talking about the media and how it reacts in situations of crisis, and then he moved towards the crisis of the media, really, what we could term. And I'll begin where he briefly mentioned that what our constitution guarantees is the freedom of speech for citizens and not the freedom of speech of the media. And I would partially agree with him here, and just raise the point that if you look at the news media, they've really played, if you look at the history of the news media, they've really played a very, very important role in the way our constitutional right to free speech in Article 19(1)(a) has really developed over the years. So whether you begin post-independence with cases like the Romesh Thapar case or the Brij Bhushan case, which many of you all might be familiar with, or you go on to the 70s, etc., where we talk about cases around newsprint, whether it's Bennett and Coleman, the Indian Express cases, or the later cases in the 90s when you're talking about the Cricket Association case and broadcasting rights, or the DPS MMM case, which really determined the issue of intermediary liability. It's really these test cases which have revolved around media organizations that have really pushed the limits and defined the limits of what free speech rights and limitations that we have today. So there is a very, very integral link between the rights of the media and the rights of citizens if we're talking about free speech. Understandably, given the power of the media and the power to influence public opinion that it wields, we are very, very concerned, and that's why the topic today is looking at the ethics of the Indian media and whether they've breached the trust of the Indian citizen. And so what I will do here is just to lay down a brief overview of the media landscape. I'm sure in the main debate there will be much more nuanced approach to and some of these facts that I'm going to be talking about. But just to give you a sense that especially post the 90s there's been an explosion of media forms. We know that especially in cable and satellite television and DTS, we have an incredible range, incredible number of channels that have sprouted up. To give you a sense, of the 50% of the 626 cable and TV channels that were licensed by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting in 2010 and 2011, around half of them, that's over 300 channels, were news and current affair channels. So we're talking about a vast spectrum of channels that have come up. But what we notice over a period of time is if you look more closely at this, and since cable and television channels really command a large percentage of viewership, and the traditional media, print and television media still command the majority of viewership in India, of consumers, that there is a strong tendency, however, though there's such a huge number of channels, towards a sameness, a uniformity of content. A uniformity of content, almost uniform tendency towards sensationalism, and a move where variations in content are really based on ownership models rather than any substantial difference in the way that people actually approach issues. And I think anybody who flips channels will be really able to tell. And this includes the regional channels as well. Another worrying phenomenon that one sees, and a good example of this, and if you look at how ownership patterns have really developed, for instance, you'll see that there's an increasing consolidation of ownership across media forms. So whether it's people who own, whether it's say the Benetton Coleman or the HT Group, or whether it's Star India or Sun TV, just giving examples, they have ownership across forms. So whether it's distribution of cable, whether it's actually the content of satellite television, whether it's print, internet, even telecommunications, right? So in many ways, the carriage, that is the way this media actually is communicated to us, is more and more determining what content we'll actually see. And this is a shift, I think, in terms of a shift in the debate that has happened over the last 10 years, where debates around ownership patterns and debates around this carriage of the media has become crucial, and not just debates around whether content is being censored or not. Of course, this is crucially linked to media practices, and the fact that there is so much competition, for instance, within the news media has resulted in practices like sensational news, sting operations, where sometimes one can question the ethics. Recently, there's been a reverse sting that by the Jindal Group on ZTV, and two highly ranked officials in the Z Group were actually arrested and then released on bail. The entire phenomenon of paid news, we know, Running Election Stand and Paranjoy is here, and he's an author of one of the most important reports on this. The phenomenon of private treaties, where media companies actually, because they are investing in the equity market, they have tie-ups with companies and therefore will censor certain kind of reportage. In our office, we discovered this in a very interesting way. A few years ago, we were doing fact findings on construction laborers who would fall while they were constructing and basically fall to their deaths because there wasn't enough safety precautions taken. And we were tracking these, and we're doing fact findings saying that there needs to be a follow-up, there needs to be compensation. And what we noticed was that for one of the big construction companies in Bangalore, the Times of India was consistently reporting without their names mentioned. So like 4 newspapers would mention that this death took place, this accident took place, with details about the construction company and other details. Only the Times of India would not mention which group was responsible, the name of the construction company, a very basic fact in the story. And this became a recurring factor, and when we investigated this a little more, we found that the Times of India has a agreement, what is commonly called a private treaty, with that construction group. So they invest in the company. In return, the Times of India will not will black out certain news which is unfavorable. And this is not just limited to them. Many media companies do have this practice. It's an additional way of getting revenue. Highly questionable, of course. Then, of course, issues which you all might be much more familiar with. There's the entire debate around censorship of material through court cases, through using the law. Recently, we know that an NUJS student has been slapped with a defamation case by, again, Benetton Coleman in this case. And the reason why, and Paranjoy as well. And the reason is because they report a very long ongoing trademark dispute between the Financial Times and the Benetton Coleman group, and they are accused of defamation, criminal defamation. So news channels, the news industry, actually using their clout to try and bully a 20-year-old law student. Of course, she stood up to them. So the other example which you all might be familiar about, of course, is the recent example of the TV9 group and channels in Andhra Pradesh reporting a farewell party that students of Nalsad were going to. Right? And this, again, is a continuation of the certain kind of very overstated clash that the media often puts between tradition and modernity, between certain so-called traditional values that they support and modern values that youth have. And what was interesting in this case is when certain media professionals protested against what was happening, the news, the industry in Andhra Pradesh, the satellite TV industry actually got together and wrote a response defending their action, saying that, have you seen what they put up on the internet? Do you know what was going to happen at that party? Disturbing trends overall, if you talk about what's happening in the media. But on the other hand, we know that the news media remains a crucial source of information for the public. We know that they have huge influence on very, very important and crucial public issues. They continue to do investigative stories that define our political landscape, whether it's related to corruption or related to accountability of public figures. In fact, according to the TAM statistics for 2010-2011, the most watched programs for that year were news programs around the Anna Hazare anti-corruption campaign, India's World Cup victory in cricket, and the Ayodhya judgment. And the Ayodhya judgment actually is one example where the media got together in a responsible fashion, where they said that we will ensure that we will tone down our reportage to ensure that there is a certain amount, that communal violence, to ensure that we can try and prevent communal violence in that case. In fact, quite counterintuitively in many ways, the most recent annual Edelman Trust Barometer, which is a global survey done with 20,000 respondents across 25 countries, and the respondents have a very similar profile to people sitting in this audience, has shown that there's an increase in trust in the media in India, and this is attributed to a result of a diversification of options and a strong coverage of scandals. And in fact, it's shown an increase in trust across the Asia Pacific in the media. Of course, this is a limited survey, but it is one survey and it is showing a certain trend. So clearly, there are very, very divergent perceptions on the state of the media today, and the news media in particular. And I'm sure that the debate that will actually follow will throw much more light on this. So with that, I'll end my intervention, and I'll invite Jacob to give us a much more international perspective, especially looking at new technologies in the media.
To speak here twice in 1 week, and I just wanted to say thanks to the people that made that possible. It's really wonderful, and I appreciate that in India, WikiLeaks is seen as actually quite a positive thing. This is significantly different than the country that I was born in, where truth is essentially treason these days. And so to that end, I wanted to say before I start that the trial of Bradley Manning, some of you may be familiar with this. This is about to start in the United States, and it will be at Fort Meade, which is a military base run by the National Security Agency. And most of his trial will be secret, and most of the evidence will be classified. And this is for the crime of allegedly leaking documents that show war crimes and malfeasance by our government, the United States government. And this is very serious, specifically because we see that this leads to the criminalization of investigative journalism that is effective. So Julian Assange, for example, who has been in the Ecuadorian embassy for 1 year now, he is likely under a sealed indictment for the Espionage Act, which carries the death penalty. I am also likely under sealed indictment for the Espionage Act, which carries the death penalty. This is quite a chilling effect for investigative journalism. It's also quite a shame for a country that has the First Amendment and attempts to promote it, usually with war, but attempts to promote it at least with propaganda and the freedom of the press. So I'd like to say that what I have to say is not really necessarily an international perspective, but is as someone who has spent the last 3 years of my life being harassed by various different parts of the US government. So I tell you, I've met more three-letter agency people in the last 3 years than I knew that you could combine those letters in the alphabet to make. So with that, I think probably what I would say is that I think that most of the failures of the media actually are failures of the state, and they're failures of society. So what do I mean by that? I suppose what I mean is that the media, as a sort of crass capitalistic endeavor, is a failure of society. This idea that the pursuit of profit is the highest goal is something that is kind of a shame. And you see this infection of, let's say, capital in advertising and all sorts of other different things, as these two gentlemen have already mentioned. And I can't speak to the Indian context because I'm not from India, and while I have read a few Indian newspapers, I hardly think that qualifies me to make much of a point about it. But what I can say is that we do see this, especially in the United States and especially in Europe. Now, the myth is that in the West there are no limits to the press freedom, really. And after the Pentagon Papers with Daniel Ellsberg, the myth was also that, of course, that Daniel Ellsberg won and that free press had won and that people have a right to know what their democracies do in their name. But what we've actually seen also, and which will probably come out quite near the end of the year, I think, is that the New York Times, for example, when the WikiLeaks cables were being released, actually had a daily meeting which included the military, the CIA, the State Department, and a number of other people, every day to decide what they should print. Eventually, Bill Keller only had a daily call with the CIA, as I understand it. I watched a nice interview that will be in a documentary film released at the end of the year. And this completely blew my mind and really ruined my day, right? Because this is this idea that in the West, in the free West, that we don't have limits for journalism, really. Certainly not like that. And that after the Pentagon Papers, no way would the New York Times of all papers, after such an amazing US Supreme Court judgment, there would be no way that we would see such a co-option where literally the editorial room was being run with the CIA in it. This is crazy. And I'm so glad that someone captured Bill Keller admitting this on video. Actually, the scary part was that he bragged about it. It wasn't just an admission, it was pride that he was exuding in this video interview. So this is a failure, I think, of the state, though, because the state should not allow itself to pressure the media in such a way and to collaborate with the media in such a way. And people, I think, have some responsibility in their own societies, but all of societies have some responsibility for each other. And so we should see that this is a failure of several things, but one of them is blind submission to authoritarianism. This is one of the key problems, and often blind nationalism. So in the US, the New York Times was one of the main groups that was beating the war drum for the Iraq War and for the Afghan War, also known as, the war against terror, which is still ongoing. And this is a shame. I think it's actually a terrible shame, because you can pretty much do anything you want to people in the war on terror. I myself have experienced quite a lot of that, and even without having been arrested, I might add, let alone formally charged in any way. But ultimately, this comes down to how we know what we know. So when the newspaper prints a thing, one thing that Julian Assange has constantly pushed for is this concept of scientific journalism, and we see this as a media failure, which is that people in the media often argue from a position of authority, like, oh, I am an important journalist, and this is what I say, and this is the truth. Well, this is nonsense, because important journalists have economic interests. They, of course, have a reputation to uphold. They have political ties. They have friends at cocktail parties. They own property, maybe, if they're doing well. So what we should look for in the media is a citation, the way that we would look at a biology paper. Can they actually back up the statements that they have? And to this end, we should make sure that there are shield laws that protect journalists and protect sources, even in cases of alleged national security. And to this end, we should see more document leaking so that original source material may be made available to the general public, so that when the general public wishes to be able to verify whether or not a journalist is full of it, either full of the truth or something else, we will be able to know. And in fact, we can know this. And by accepting a news media that does not do this, it tells us something about the failures of epistemology in our societies around the world. And again, this blind submission to authoritarianism. In this case, it's this kind of authoritarianism of the reputation of a paper. And this is an interesting thing because reputation obviously matters. But at the same time, it is perhaps important to recognize that it is just not possible for the media to always be accurate. In fact, there are accidental inaccuracies. And so if we have this original source material and it is freely available to people, it allows for us to peer review the media. And in fact, it can be done without the courts. And in fact, this solves some of the key problems. And one of them is this nonsense notion of censorship. See, the notion of censorship is again this idea that we should force people to believe certain things, to stop them from saying certain things, and that we could be the moral, ethical judge of a thing that is being said. But I don't buy this. I think actually the solution to allegedly bad or harmful speech is more speech. So obviously there is a problem when people give a press conference and the facts are reported by the media incorrectly. But the solution to that problem is to show those journalists as the assholes that they are. It is not to silence them. It is not to sanction them. It is to simply show that they are not worth listening to ever again. And the way to do that, I believe, is with more speech, not less. Bill Keller, I think, though I don't personally know him, I'm sort of glad about that. He's a great example of this. I mean, a blatant propaganda arm for the CIA, literally. And it's unbelievable, actually, to see that kind of thing. And this is a failure of society. When people have such a vested interest in murdering other folks and in political connections to maintain access, this tells us that society and the media have both failed in a very strong way. And in fact, the fact that he could even maintain an op-ed column in the New York Times tells us about how blatantly we ignore these facts. And it's quite terrible when we consider the more than 150,000 dead people in Iraq. Right? So that's a failure of the media right there, but that's also a failure of every American, myself included in this room and everywhere around the world, to not actually say that this is wrong, especially on a false pretense. And there is this notion also, the Afghan war is the righteous war, right? This idea that it's somehow okay, again, to have an enemy and to eradicate them. And this is something which is even more disgusting, that when we had a righteous cause, we decided to take that righteousness and to use it to create more human suffering. This is a failure, not only of media, but of society and the state. And at the same time, I support the right of people to say those types of things in public, because that allows us to know their character, and that is very important. But I think that we have to actually create some systemic change in order to make the rest of this change that we would like to see happen for media accountability, for example. I think, for example, we need economic incentives for whistleblowers so that when people tell the truth, instead of facing legal persecution, they actually have some legal protection. This will help people to tell the truth. Right now we see the opposite with the Associated Press and even with Fox News, much to the great irony of everyone who watches Fox News, or doesn't, I suppose. And this is fascinating because these are the same people that called for the assassination of Julian Assange, literally, that he should be killed with a drone strike, as if drone strikes are legitimate, for example, that assassination is somehow legitimate. So I think that the thing is that we should see some legal protections of journalists so that they can tell the truth, instead of, let's say, what will happen with the Risen case, what will happen with some of these other major cases with journalists. But we must also see that whistleblowers get the same protection, because what we see with the AP case is that the US government and the Department of Justice, supposedly, are trying very hard to chill all government workers that actually have access to the truth and to prevent them from speaking about the truth. And so in a sense, this makes the bureaucratic elements of the government, it makes them an arm of propaganda. And this is something that is perhaps the biggest failure of media and the state together, to make propaganda, especially in service of war, and definitely in service of profit in war. This is a huge failure. But there are individuals who are quite courageous, who are willing to speak out. But it is only because at the moment the law, the policy, society, and the government all stand opposed to them. It takes someone, apparently like Bradley Manning, who is willing to literally die to tell us the truth that most of the people, I imagine, in the world and in this room have ignored. And have ignored it actually at his peril. So every single one of you that does not speak up on his behalf, I think there's something that's terribly wrong about that. And especially when we consider what it is that he has done for us. And the Hindu, for example, ran many of the cables and many facts from the WikiLeaks releases which he is alleged to have released. So there is even a benefit for India and the Indian people. And yet we do not see on every newspaper calls to help him as an individual citizen telling the truth about what happens in our name. So with this, I suppose what I would say is that I think that it is important that we expand things like truth being a defense against libel. I was a little surprised to find out that truth is not always a defense against libel in India, but I was also surprised to find out that you can't burn a flag. So I admit I'm full of surprises in incredible India. But I think we can agree on a few things. One of them is that we should not uninvent the printing press. Once printed pages, we should reject this, even if what it says is wrong, even if it is factually incorrect. We must resist the temptation to erase history as we resisted the temptation to require a king's mark on every printed page, and that we came up with solutions such as printing a retraction the next day. Something like this is much better than censorship, I think, and it serves history as well. And so I think we should reject a secretive vanguard as well, in that sense that the best national security comes from an informed populace. And information may include some misinformation, I might add, that is incorrectly reported, but sometimes actually just straight up lying. Because with more speech, we will be able to detect these things. We'll be able to see these things. And with original source documentation, we'll in fact be able to see who consistently says things without being able to cite them, without being able to show evidence. And it would mean that people like Bill Keller, they probably would still be around in the media, but we would know what to think of that Bill Keller. And I think that that's something that we can really all strive for all around the world. And the United States is a great example of a place where we could see a lot of improvements in press freedom, especially when people involved with investigative journalism face an espionage charge, which is a political crime, for telling the truth about things that were done in our own name, even. So with that, I think that I probably have taken enough time. But I wanted to say one last thing, which is if we think about the internet and its influence in the world, we can see that finally we can also move away from a total media vanguard where each person has a right to free speech, where each person has the ability to do things as journalists would do things. And we must protect every individual's right. So in this